Hi, I'm Leonowicz. I'm a gender and women's studies student from Warren Wilson College, where I work on the Empower crew. I'm originally from New York City, so a lot of the work that I had been doing in the past was happening in New York City. I was working for a queer youth drop-in center in New York City called Generation Q, and a lot of what we did as youth workers and as the program coordinator was to advocate for students and for youth within the public school system. Now, what was happening in New York City a few years ago was that the Dignity for All Students Act was passed by City Council and other governing bodies, and what that legislation did was to provide comprehensive training for faculty and staff on the elementary, middle, and high school levels in public schools against harassment in order to create safe spaces in hallways, in classrooms, etc., for students, and attempted to challenge harassment based on race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc., etc., etc. And what happened with that was that our mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, failed to implement it because he thought, literally, verbatim, that the piece of legislation was silly and unnecessary. And so what we did as an organization was lobby him for years, basically, along with the help of other advocacy organizations. And the way we did that was mainly by training the youth that we had coming into the space on how to be activists. So what we did was train them on how to petition people. So we would go out onto the streets with a petition explaining what the Dignity for All Students Act was, and then also with a script on students' experiences, based on students' experiences with harassment in high schools, in middle schools, etc. We mainly only had high school students coming through the space though. And so we would just start conversations with people on the street, get their signatures, and once we got 5,000 to 10,000 signatures, sent them off to Mayor Bloomberg and to other people in positions of power in the attempt to pressure him to implement the act. And other things that we did were we actually went to Mayor Bloomberg's office a number of times. We staged protests outside of his office in the rain often. Sometimes, somehow, I don't know, that happens, like when you're staging queer events, there's always rain. So we staged protests outside of his office. We made appointments with him and had students start conversations with him as to why anti-harassment legislation was important in New York City schools and not silly and not unnecessary. We took a few trips to Albany, our state capital, on key lobbying days, mainly lobbying days for queer-related issues, and had conversations with politicians there explaining why DASA was important and why it really needed to be implemented. And so through that work, with our organization, with other advocacy organizations, DASA is implemented now. Mayor Bloomberg took the point, I guess, from us all. And so last year he decided finally, mostly with the help from our Speaker of the House, Christine Quinn, to actually implement it in New York City schools. And so that's like forthcoming. And so what we did in terms of like hands-on education, seeing as there was that lack of training for faculty and staff and training for students in schools, was that we developed and facilitated workshops that we would perform in schools, like in classrooms and in after-school programs. And we started, before that, like the precursor to that was starting conversations with staff and faculty members, calling them up, telling them what we wanted to do in their school, why it was important to create safe spaces in the classroom, in after-school programs, and then work to develop these workshops. And a few of them that we did were bystander intervention for elementary, middle, and high school students. So we just developed a workshop that would provide strategies for students to call out harassment and bullying when they saw it. And so we did a few we staged a few examples of like what that would look like, and then had students perform their own sort of role-playing situation where they would challenge certain types of harassment. And then another workshop that we did was Don't Just Stand By. No, that was that one, sorry. Sticks and Stones, which is an anti-name calling workshop that we developed that looked to challenge language and the ways students interact with each other on a daily basis through just like interpersonal talking. So we looked at like the origins of like harmful language and how to explain like why certain terminologies were offensive or were harmful, and like what kind of results they had for students, and then worked on building new vocabularies for students. And we also developed a workshop that where the students created an anti-harassment law for themselves that they would implement themselves. So they created a law basically that would exist within their classroom on like the at the side of the blackboard, or at the side of wherever their after school program was existing. And so they just like developed all these rules for each other, like be respectful, don't call each other names, don't hit, don't blah 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 blah. And so all the students in the classroom would then sign it and then basically check themselves on it regularly. And so that's what we did like within classrooms. We also, in the hopes of raising awareness on why anti-harassment legislation was important, we developed 2 public service announcements that took experiences that students in our space that were coming through our space, like their experiences with harassment, and explaining why DASA would have helped them get through school if they had dropped out, or would help them get through school if they were still in school. And those we sent to Mayor Bloomberg and also a bunch of other politicians and also to other advocacy groups in order to help them decide to latch on with us. We also created a bunch of zines, which are self-published small books about our experiences and about why DASA was important and why bystander intervention was important. And that's pretty much all that I did in New York.
And she's a student.